That's what we'll call it. Good morning. I'm live. I hear myself. We're on time. I don't know that we're ready, but we're on time. So we'll get started. If you want to turn over to Ezekiel, we're actually going to jump into chapter 42 and very quickly move on from there. As I was working on the lesson this week, I outlined the rest of the book, the elements of 40 through 48 that we haven't talked about yet, which is really 42 through 48. We're done with chapters 40 and 41. I thought, okay, we can get this done, and then that'll leave me one more week. And I thought, well, what are we going to talk about next week? And I had a couple of ideas. I thought, or I could just take 2 weeks to finish Ezekiel, and then I know what I'm doing for the next 2 weeks. So that's what we're going to do. So it says 42 to 48. And what you have on the first page is actually one from last week as well that outlines what I'm calling the instructions. Remember I mentioned last week, I've really been approaching this section of the book. We looked first at the measurement and descriptions as they were portrayed all through these various chapters, with the majority of that content being in the first 2 chapters and then dispersed through the rest. And then what I'm referring to as instructions, and I'm using that very broadly, and I'll illustrate what I mean by that here in just a minute with the first set of verses. Because there are a few other things that are not just instructions that we'll key in on and really finish out with more next week. And if we get into it this morning, that's fine. It's really the latter part of the handout, the division of the land. So after instructions, Ezekiel in the vision is given information about dividing of the land, which are also instructions technically, and just for more or less a repeat of what they had in Joshua. So we'll get to that either later today or next week. But to give you an idea what I mean by the idea of instructions, let's start in verses 13 and 14 of chapter 42. Chapter 42. Again, Ezekiel is caught up in the vision still, the man with him leading him around, doing the measurements, and also times God speaking to him, particularly for the instructions. Then he said to me, the north and the south rooms facing the temple courtyard are the priest's rooms, where the priests who approach the Lord will eat the most holy offerings. Ooh, that sounds really loud. There they will put the most holy offerings, the grain offerings, the sin offerings, and the guilt offerings, for the place is holy. Once the priests enter the holy precincts, they are not to go into the outer court until they leave behind the garments in which they minister, for these are holy. They are to put on other clothes before they go near the places that are for the people. So if you recall or remember from when we were going over the measurements and descriptions, this particular area of what's part of the inner courtyard, these rooms for the priests, and these were the 2 sets of spaces on each side of the temple, those three-story building technically, with the 30 rooms in each side. Rooms for their preparations, things where they would go to. So in these verses we see the instructions for the use of these rooms. Okay, what were they supposed to do with them? This is where they would go to eat the most holy offerings. And if you were listening, and again, I'm not particularly sure what translation you might see or what you might see in your translation. I was reading from the NIV. There's a lot of emphasis on the separation of holy and common, which we've talked about before, and which is going to be an important theme as we continue on as well. But just look in those 2 verses. You should see the use of the term holy at least 5 times, depending on translation. So again, one of the key lessons I think that Ezekiel is to carry back to the people through this vision is understanding of that relationship with God. God is holy, and they are to be holy. And these instructions, this system they were given, the sacrificial system and the laws that they were to follow, in part were to teach them how to approach God, because he is holy, and trying to better understand that concept, which is certainly, I think, an important element for us, which we're going to dig into just a little bit more this morning as we go along with some of these instructions. The other thing we're going to notice is that they're not new. Okay, these instructions. If you go back, you remember your studies of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, a little bit in Exodus. The same principles, and in some cases, the exact same instructions have already been given to the people. And again, I think they're for a reason, and we'll go through that as we look at some of these. So in chapter 43, we have, again, in this section, we read earlier about the dimensions of the altar that was in front of the temple. And then after those dimensions are given, we have here in verses 18 through 27 of chapter 43, some of the instructions about their use of the altar, and particularly its dedication. And that's what we see here It was a 7-day process. If you read through the verses, we're not going to take the time this morning to do that. But it would begin with sacrificing a young bull to purify the altar. And then for 7 days, they were to offer a male goat as a sin offering. And over the 7 days, they were also to offer a young bull and ram as burnt offerings. The content in Ezekiel 43 is very similar to what we find in Exodus 29, particularly verses 35 and 37. And in that section of Scripture, we have the ordination of Aaron and his sons as priests, as well as purifying the altar, preparing it for use. That process was also the last 7 days and included offering a young bull each day as part of the process. Let me just read those few verses, 35 through 37 of Exodus 29. Do for Aaron and his sons everything I've commanded you, taking 7 days to ordain them. Sacrifice a bull each day as a sin offering to make atonement. Purify the altar by making atonement for it and anoint it to consecrate it. For 7 days make atonement for the altar and consecrate it. Then the altar will be most holy, and whatever touches it will be holy. Again, we know this temple was not built, this construction, upon the return of the exiles to Israel, to Jerusalem. I was talking with someone the other day, and they were asking about the dimensions and how does this look like compared to the others, and particularly the temple of Zerubbabel. So as they went back from the exile and rebuilt, and that temple was nowhere near the dimensions or the grandeur, the perfection of this vision, nor was it intended to be. Okay, because the lessons of this vision are a little bit different than that. So that temple was very different in terms of its scope and dimensions. But again, is the purpose of these various instructions, I think, because much of them, and this hit me this morning, always last minute thoughts, I should put that in class. I didn't go back, but I will for my own edification. You're welcome to if you want. And look at how many of these instructions deal with their sacrifices and their presentation, their approach to God. I think a majority of them do. Again, that's just me thinking off the cuff about all the different instructions that we're going to be seeing quickly. Other than the division of the land, that's a very different aspect of it. But the majority of these deal with some type of their sacrificial system, and their approach to God, and acknowledging again or remembering, teaching them, He is holy. And he is to be approached, to be presented in a very particular way. You don't just willy-nilly decide this is what I'll do, because your Creator has given you the directions to be in relationship with Him, to follow Him. Again, I think this is a reminder of things where they failed before. We've already seen that lesson with other aspects of the book. And this is happening because of your idolatry, because you profaned my name, because you profaned my temple. So let me remind you of what that system, how it should be operating. How you are to approach me, the instructions that you have for making your sacrifices. You've got to be holy because He is holy. Let's move on into chapter 44, and we're going to keep pulling that thread, be holy. We've got to wrestle with it for ourselves as well a little bit more today than we have in some of our previous classes. In chapter 44, let's just look at the first few verses to get started, because there's one other element in these latter parts, these latter chapters, that the commentators love to go crazy with. I'll at least point it out to you, so for your own reading you can realize I'll offer a recommendation how to deal with it. Chapter 44, verse 1, Then the man brought me back to the outer gate of the sanctuary, the one facing east, and it was shut. The Lord said to me, This gate is to remain shut, it must not be opened, no one may enter through it. It is to remain shut, because the Lord, the God of Israel, has entered through it. The prince himself is the only one who may sit inside the gateway to eat in the presence of the Lord. He is to enter by the way of the portico of the gateway and go out the same way. Then the man brought me by the way of the north gate to the front of the temple. I looked and I saw the glory of the Lord filling the temple of the Lord, and I fell face down. Remember in chapter 43, that section opens with Ezekiel seeing in the vision the glory of God returning to the temple, filling the temple with His presence. And then it goes on to give some other instructions, or some other dimensions we've already talked about. Then in 44, he takes them back outside and says that east gate is now closed. And it's to remain shut because the Lord entered through the gate. Although we'll see in just a few minutes, there's some exceptions to that of when the gate would be open. But only one person would be able to go through. Again, because the Lord went through. But the prince could sit in the gateway for the purpose of eating portions of the sacrifice that he would have brought, whether it be fellowship or the atonement sacrifices. As I say, did well, he's sitting there to eat. And again, if we haven't thought about their system, some of their sacrifices were meant to be eaten when they brought them, okay, as part of the process. I did not go back through Leviticus to remind myself which ones those were. Okay, so you're welcome to do so, but I did not. That's the next question. Who is the prince? Who is the prince? That's the question. And commentators go nuts with this. Particularly chapters 44, 45, 46, 48, this prince is referred to in several instances. And depending on the translation that you have, I've been working from the NIV, I think you all recognize, the term is used 36 times in Ezekiel throughout the book. Okay? And it has different uses. Makes it easy to figure it out. A couple of examples for you. In chapter 12, it's very clearly used to refer to the rulers of Israel. It talks about you rulers, you kings of Israel, okay, the princes of Israel. And there's several instances throughout Ezekiel where that same type of reference is used. In those sections where we looked at the destruction of the nations, the prophecies of the destruction of the other nations, the term is also used to refer to those rulers, to those kings. The Prince of Egypt is referred to several times in those sections when we had extended visions about the destruction of Egypt used there. It's also used to refer to Messiah. We've looked at a couple of those, not quite as many in the early parts of Ezekiel, and that's where we get into the challenge of the latter part of Ezekiel, depending on how you want to try to understand them. As with anything you're reading, context matters, and so you should make sure you understand the context of the various sections or what is the elements here that we're looking at, to try to understand some of the specific uses of this term and where it goes to. So back to this particular section. And I think in chapters 43 through 48, for Ezekiel and the exiles, remember that in part this vision is for them as well. We're learning lessons and understanding it in our lens today of living in a new covenant, but for them it's the old covenant. Okay, when they hear the term prince, it most likely is going to mean for them ruling, and that's my speculation. I think that's what it would mean for someone hearing, seeing this, or Ezekiel seeing this, or the people hearing this. Some future ruler, their ruling class. And it doesn't always necessarily mean a king, because we know going back they won't have a physical king per se. They'll have governors and other political leaders, but it can also mean rulers of the people, particularly business rulers or those that have authority over them. Different aspects of that. As we get into, again, some of these instructions, they refer to the prince. It talks about the prince making sacrifices or presenting sacrifices for himself. It talks about the prince allocating his lands to his sons, to his servants. If you are of the persuasion, that's probably not the right word, if you're of the belief of the 1,000-year reign and the millennial reign and Christ coming back, that 1,000 years on earth, there is a subset that David will reign under Christ in that period of time. And so many will look to these references to prince to be David. Okay, that's one possible interpretation. They will also apply it to Messiah. Well, that all refers to Christ. Okay. Again, we come back to context. Well, Christ doesn't need to make a sacrifice for himself. Christ doesn't need to apportion land to his sons or to his servants because Christ owns it all anyway. There are certainly elements that seem to be messianic in Ezekiel, and are, in my opinion. Okay? But a lot of these instructions about this sacrificial system, I don't think so, per se. Now, in the big picture, as we'll see next week as we draw it all together and talk about the city, and Ezekiel's vision of the city, which parallels, I think, John's vision of the city, of the new Jerusalem, and the representation of God's presence with his people. We'll see some of that all come together. That certainly is forward-looking. But not all of these are. So to answer your question, Richard, it's look into the context and see what we're dealing with in the various sections. And then step back and say, okay, if I want to try to understand this holistically in a new lens, in a new covenant lens, yes, there are elements that are messianic, but not necessarily all of them. And so take some digging. We've got to look at it and try to tease through and understand. Again, some of the lessons for the folks that were hearing this and Ezekiel seeing this vision and conveying it to the people, and now us many, many years later looking at it and trying to draw some understanding. understanding from it as well.
Where are you leaning as a person?
In most of these, where it deals with specific instructions for the prince to do this or that, I would lean this is a description of the ruler's activities. Then when we get to the big picture context and look at all of this holistically, and Ezekiel seeing this city and these elements, it's going to be about God's reign with his people, which would include Messiah. I guess if it was easy, anybody would do it, wouldn't they? If it was easy, then, well, God would need to have to study it, understand it. It's not impossible, not by any stretch, okay? It's just pulling the threads together and realizing how things fit together. But also keeping in mind, there's a meaning for the folks, and again, for them, ruler, okay, ruler. Because they don't know the new covenant. They won't know the new covenant. They have promises of Messiah. And if we kind of think about these elements in the very kind of literal interpretations I think they had, I understand, I think, or I can appreciate why why those in the first century were looking for a physical king. We're looking for a new David. As they hear these prophecies and get these visions are presented to them. We have to keep in mind and remember, God wasn't giving that vision just for that moment in time. God's giving these visions and prophecies across his creation, across time, for his plan to develop and for us to see and appreciate it more fully. We have the reference in the New Testament. I think it's Peter. Don't quote me on that. But the prophets longed to understand what they were conveying to the people. And in instances, they didn't. Not in all instances. Fully understood the message. There's a message for them, but it may not have been the complete revelation as we have through the Word. I was kind of reeling. I can just see it in the face. I was like, whoa. It is. But as we dig in and begin to, I think, pull these together, where we're going is an appreciation, again, for who God is, for what he has done. And his design from the beginning. And giving us all these pieces to help us put together and understand. Sure.
You know what I'm saying? And who's going to keep those instructions compiled and bring forward to the time they actually need all this?
Yeah. Well, I told you last week, and I'm going to say it again. That's up to God, all right? He found a way, okay, through scribes, through men of learning to record. Okay, the Spirit inspired men to record these notes for us, these chapters, these books that we have. So that was God's work, okay, to carry it through. And we have that evidence of that from the artifacts with the scriptures, quote unquote, okay, through time. But why? Why so early? Remember, those in exile still have learning to go through. They still have heart changes to undergo. Because they're complaining about, well, we're just here because we're being punished for what the folks before us did. I said, well, not quite. Because you are still engaged in that idolatry. You still profaned the temple, God's holy name. And it's a pattern of your people. And that was God's point to them. Look at your history. You came by this honestly. You learned from the people before you. And you did exactly what they did overall instead of adhering to the directions. So again, my opinion, let me remind you of those directions. Be holy. Don't just walk into the temple. Don't just bring foreigners in. Don't just willy-nilly whatever sacrifice you want. Don't bring an idol into the temple of God. That's not in covenant. That's not living and working and walking in step with their God. I think a big part of this again is a reminder. Hold on to that. I want to get to a point, but I don't want to fit it in with another part of this. So let's keep going just a little bit in Ezekiel 44. Ezekiel 44. So in verse 4, we read about Ezekiel was taking back to the front of the temple, sees the glory of God again filling the temple, falls face down. Okay, that is the appropriate response when you are exposed to the presence of God, to humble yourself in front of him. Okay, good response. The remainder of this chapter addresses the service of the priest. And we have talked about this previously, so I'm not going to go back through it again. But remember, God was displeased with the Levites because of their idolatry. Okay, they were the ones that were to present the offerings. They were the conduit for the people to him. You know, they disrupted the entire system. They profaned his holy name, with the exception of Zadok and Zadok's line. As we're going back again, pointing out that Zadok was zealous for the Lord during the time of David, pleasing to the Lord, and so it is his descendants, according to the vision, that were to serve before the Lord, and then the other Levites were to perform the duties of the temple. Okay, so that's the bulk of 44. I'll just give you some examples of the illustrations in there. Let's look on in verse 17, and we're going to pick up some of the various instructions that are provided for the priest. Just look at verses 17 through 19, just to give you a sampling. So it's referring to the priests. When they enter the gates of the inner court, they are to wear linen clothes. They must not wear any woolen garment while ministering at the gates of the inner court or inside the temple. They are to wear linen turbans on their heads and linen undergarments around their waists. They must not wear anything that makes them perspire. When they go out into the outer court where the people are, they are to take off the clothes they have been ministering in and are to leave them in the sacred rooms and put on other clothes so they do not consecrate the people by means of their garments. Verses 17 to 31, there's an entire series of just instructions about the priests and regulations for them, okay, in their service. This deals with the wearing of the priestly garments, again, very similar to the instructions that were given back for Aaron and his sons as those garments were first made in their service as priests. In this section, and there's just a whole mixture of them. There's regulations about their hair, about being trimmed. They were to refrain from drinking wine before entering into the sanctuary, the inner court area. There are regulations for marriage. The priests were to serve as judges. Regulations about mourning for dead relations. Again, remember, they are God's representatives. Particularly the line of Zadok, those performing the particular rituals, they're in a holy state, a holy place. They can't defile themselves or they can't serve. So they were given, again, reminded of the regulations. And then in the end of that section, a reminder that the Lord will be the Levites' inheritance, that he will provide for them. Again, all of this consistent with the instructions you find in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. I thought about it, but I did not go back and detail out, okay, the hair regulations are here, the mourning regulations are here. You can do that, because I did look some of them up. Yes, they are consistent, but I didn't go through all of them detail by detail. But ironically, in a separate activity for me, some of my daily reading, I am in the midst of Leviticus right now. And so reading about the sacrifices and the regulations for the sacrifices has been very helpful as I think about this context and the reminders that Ezekiel is being given. But in chapter 44, I want to point out verse 23. Okay. These Levites, these in the line of Zadok, they are to teach my people the difference between the holy and the common, and show them how to distinguish between the unclean and the clean. So I'll come back to your question, Richard. Why are they getting all this now? They're in exile. They're going to be there for at least another 66 years, 64, 65 years, by the time this particular part of the vision is coming out. Okay? They've still got to be taught to understand these differences between that which is holy and that which is common, between that which is clean, that which is unclean. Do you remember the job of Ezekiel besides being this visionary, this prophet presenting all these visions to the people? You remember what his role was? You're mouthing it, Gene. Come on, speak. No guessing. This is actually a really important point. So you need to remember this, okay? When Ezekiel was called, and the timing of his calling was really important, because he had to reach the point of maturity to begin his service as a, starts with a P, priest. He is a prophet of God. The other P word. Ezekiel is in the line of the priesthood. Now, I don't know. Thought about this morning. It's like, is he in Zadok's line? Is he in Zadok's line? I don't know. I didn't track it down. I'll have to do that later on. It really doesn't matter as far as this, because God is using him to present this vision, all of the visions and all of the prophecies for the people, for the nations. That you, priest of God, learn these lessons too. You need to share these. I think it would have been particularly poignant for Ezekiel, a priest. One, certainly to see. Again, I go back to the imagery that I will not forget in Ezekiel is the profaning of the temple, the idolatry in the temple. That to me just, it's an amazing vision. Amazing. And the lessons there. But I'm not a priest in the sense that Ezekiel was. He was supposed to know better. And I think these lessons for him would have really, this is just me guessing, if I'm Ezekiel, it's like, wow. Knock after knock, and look how far off you've been. How much we've missed the mark in serving our God, who has been so gracious to us through our history. And he's going to give us another chance. Mercy and grace to come back. He's going to bring us back. We've got to learn these lessons. Okay, let's draw this in a little bit for us. And we still have some more regulations to go through. Don't worry, we're going to get through them. But what do they teach us? You thought about that going through? I've done a study of Leviticus. Taught a class on Leviticus. Not easy. But there's lessons for us. What can we glean from a lot of these types of instructions, from a better understanding of this system that God put in place? Say again? He's orderly. He is.
It's not just order. God is precise.
Okay.
He has said exactly what he expects, but in that precision, he's got a lot of grace. And that's a hard one for us to balance. It's easy to become pharisaical and have these rules, but each of his rules had a meaning. It wasn't just an arbitrary rule. And he tells us why he wanted it. So sometimes we have to accept God said it for a reason. It's not just he's making stuff up. So we see a lot of his nature, his personality, which helps us today that
Yep.
God's got high expectations, but he also has a lot of grace.
The system is teaching his people then and now about him. We also need to pull together. Again, it's divine. So I'm going to say it, all right? We've been going through Revelation. We're going through Ezekiel. Okay, the crossover is there on purpose. All this focus on the physical temple, the dwelling of God, understanding that which is clean, that which is unclean, understanding God's holiness. Where's that temple at today? Was it Wednesday night, I think you quoted the passage? I think it was. Where's that temple today? I'm looking at it. Okay, now cross in your mind all those thoughts about that which is clean and unclean, being holy, that which defiles holiness. We learn from them, from understanding the system. Hebrew writer put it out there. Sacrifices won't take away. But the sacrifice does. We walk in the light as he is in the light. His blood sanctifies, covers us. That temple resides because of the sacrifice of Christ. We learn and better understand what Christ did. God's holy nature hasn't changed from day one. Our ability, it's not our ability, our opportunity to approach him, to be in covenant with him is only because of what he has done. This whole system, and understanding all these regulations, all these instructions, is to point out, well, to me, magnifies the work of Christ and the opportunity we have. And for me, it should. I don't take it for granted or just disregard those lessons in the Old Testament and these systems. I'm being motivated to love and serve Him because of what He's doing for me and the opportunity I have to live for Him, to be transformed. This is what they would not have understood or gotten to in that system, this notion of transformation. And this is where we'll make the transition, the connection more fully next week, and Lee is carrying us through in Revelation of the spiritual life we have, even now, but that we look forward to more fully.
The whole structure of the tabernacle temple in law was in drawing people closer to God, showing what you must go through to have access to God. He was drawing people to Him. There were 3 curtains you had to go through to get there, and each one was a weeding out process, and the sacrifice of the altar, the cleansing of the laver, and then inside the holy place, all of those things to reveal Himself to us. And one of the striking things of what we just read was the garments of the priest, if they sweated in them, and someone else touched the sweat of their labor, they would become holy. Which is, don't let anyone else touch them, because they will become holy. And it showed that not by the work of humans is this going to be possible. This is by the work of the Holy God. It's by everything that He provides. All of these sacrifices were not wasteful because they fed His priests.
His priests.
Everything accomplished something, but the ultimate thing it accomplished was salvation. And salvation needs to be understood as a very, very simple concept. Lostness is separated from God. Salvation is union with God. And the whole process was reunion with God.
And through Christ, He envelops all of this system for us. And again, I don't often remember or think about some of the details of the system. Back to the preciseness and usefulness. God used this, all of it, and to feed the Levites in a big part. Simple, almost rule of thumb. It's not perfect across all the sacrifices, but anytime you read about wave offerings, okay, somebody gets to eat that. Okay, it's waved and not burned for a reason. Okay, someone's going to eat that. So, to provide for it. And that's, again, the element, they will be the Levite, the Lord will be the Levites' inheritance. Provide for them both in land and in food and in service for their entire households. Because there's a lot of Levites that have to go through this and deal with it. All right, let's pick up again in chapter 45. And we're going to look at, I believe we're picking up in verse 19. Excuse me, verse 9. Verse 9 of chapter 45. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. I think I am missing something. It's not going to be in your notes. No, I know, yeah, no, that's not the right one. Anyway, we'll go through it. It's not in your notes. Okay. Chapter 45, verse 9. This is what the sovereign Lord says. You have gone far enough, O princes of Israel. Give up your violence and oppression, and do what is just and right. Stop dispossessing my people, declares the sovereign Lord. You are to use accurate scales, an accurate ephah, an accurate bath. The ephah and the bath are to be the same size. The bath containing 1/10 of a homer, and the ephah 1/10 of a homer. The homer is to be the standard measure for both. The shekel is to consist of 20 gerahs, 20 shekels plus 25 shekels plus 15 shekels equal 1 mina. One of the instructions we have here for, again, the rulers, as well as the priests that would be involved in weighing out, is to use accurate scales and measures. And that's one of the elements. I know it was in the slides. I don't know what happened to it. It's gone now. As I made revisions, it's no longer there. But that was the point I wanted to draw out from there. Looking at the aspects of the accurate weights and measures. And from there, we're going to be looking at some of the other instructions that deal with a variety of the festivals. In chapter 46 in particular, we have openings again, our instruction, we talked about the east gate just a few minutes ago being closed. Well, there's an opportunity for it to be open. Let's look in the first part of chapter 46, beginning verse 1. This is what the sovereign Lord says. The gate of the inner court facing east is to be shut on the 6 working days, but on the Sabbath day and on the day of the new moon is to be opened. The prince is to enter from the outside through the portico of the gateway and stand by the gatepost. The priests are to sacrifice his burnt offering and his fellowship offerings. He is to worship at the threshold of the gateway and then go out, but the gate will not be shut until evening. On the Sabbaths and the new moons, the people of the land are to worship in the presence of the Lord at the entrance to that gateway. The burnt offering the prince brings to the Lord on the Sabbath day is to be 6 male rams and a ram, all without defect. And he goes on and talks about the grain offering and the offerings for the different, the Sabbath and the new moon specifically. And this is an instance where the gate will be opened. And again, the prince would be able to enter through and eat, to bring his offerings to be sacrificed, to be presented by the priest to the Lord. And again, you have a reflection of the earlier instructions in Leviticus and Deuteronomy for the Sabbath day and the new moon offerings. And then verses 11 and 12, it just talks about the free will offerings for the prince. And again, I bring this up because it deals with the east gate. Anytime the prince was to bring, or ruler, if you want to insert that word in there, or to provide a free will offering, and that could be either a burnt or a peace offering, the east gate would be open for him so that his offerings could be brought in through that gate. And to your question earlier, Richard, about trying to understand and looking at some of these contexts, again, Christ would not need to make sacrifices for himself. So the prince bringing sacrifices, and these illustrations are these instructions of providing for his free will, or the priest offering his sacrifices, presenting his sacrifices. Suggests to me again, as they're thinking about it, it would be their rulers in what he would be doing and bringing it together. Down to verses 13 through 15 of chapter 46, again we get more instructions about the morning and the morning offerings. Every day you are to provide a year-old lamb without defect for a burnt offering to the Lord. Morning by morning you shall provide it. You are also to provide with it morning by morning a grain offering consisting of 1/6 of an ephah and with 1/3 of a hin of oil to moisten the flour. Presenting this grain offering to the Lord is a lasting ordinance. So the lamb, the grain offering, and the oil shall be provided morning by morning for a regular burnt offering. And that's consistent with what they would have been told previously when they were first given instructions for offering their sacrifices and the daily offerings. This is again a reminder of what they're supposed to do. And then one more section out of chapter 46, again dealing with, in chapter 46, picking up in verse 16. This is what the sovereign Lord says. If the prince makes a gift from his inheritance to one of his sons, it will also belong to his descendants. It is to be their property by inheritance. If, however, he makes a gift from his inheritance to one of his servants, the servant may keep it until the year of freedom, then it will revert to the prince. His inheritance belongs to his sons only. It is theirs. The prince must not take any of the inheritance of the people, driving them off their property. He is to give his sons their inheritance out of his own property, so that none of my people will be separated from his property. And then verse 17, you may have a different term than freedom. You might have some of the liberty is in some translations, and some go ahead and use jubilee. Okay, so in the year of return, any land that had been sold to a foreigner or someone outside of the family line, that was to come back. Okay, again, a reminder for them of what they were supposed to do. Any property given by the prince, quote unquote, the ruler, to his son remained in the family. If it went to someone outside the family, then it would be returned in the year of liberty or in the year of jubilee. And we've got those instructions in Leviticus 25 regarding jubilee and the return of property and people, which I think we discussed in our class. I'm not sure that was ever done. We have no record of the Israelites ever actually observing jubilee. And in part, 70 years, God's going to give his land that rest that the people never did.
I think it's kind of striking in all of this. The people clamored for a king when God was to be the king.
Right.
So God gave them a king. But here in these instructions, you have kind of a reunification of the priesthood and the royalty, both in submission to God. And
That's a great point.
You had a punishment on Saul for usurping the role of the priest and offering sacrifices when that was not his
Example.
to do. And then you had the kings that separated themselves from the temple and from God and just exercised civil power. And God is blending all of that together. And in Zechariah, he raises up Zerubbabel as a governor and Joshua as a priest. He sends Nehemiah as a governor and Ezra as a priest. And there's a working together, a blending together of religious and civil life as one and the same. And that
Great example.
the people separated those things because they're both under God.
Right. Exactly. He's bringing him back to him under his authority and leadership. That's a great point. That's a great point. See, it does help to pull all the threads, put all the books together, all the lessons, to see God's wisdom. Yeah, it's just amazing to see what he's doing in bringing these elements together. I'm try to get one more. Okay. And this is actually going to be a nice transition for us, where we'll go into next week and finish up. And you've got in that first page the instructions, okay, at least as I see them laid out in these various chapters. And I'm not survey class, I'm not trying to go through detail all the instructions. But there's one other large element of Ezekiel in these last couple of chapters, 47 and 48 primarily, that deals with the division of the land. When we go back to chapter 45, there's an introduction of this in chapter 45 in verses 1 through 7. And when you first read this, you think, what? And if you read it in isolation, you really will be thinking, I have no idea what this means. But when you align it with what's in 47 and really in 48, it begins to make more sense. But let's read verses 1 through 7 of chapter 45 just to give you a kind of a teaser and introduction of what we're going to deal with next week. When you allot the land as inheritance, you are to present to the Lord a portion of this land as a sacred district. A sacred district. 25,000 cubits long and 20,000 cubits wide, the entire area will be holy. Of this, a section 500 cubits squares to be for the sanctuary, with 50 cubits around it for open land. Okay. Remember we talked about the dimensions of the temple of the sanctuary area, 500 by 500. Okay. That portion, what we spent a couple of weeks talking about, is inside, again in this vision, of this other area, of this sacred district. Okay, this is something that's a little bit different. That we haven't seen before. And we'll talk more modern equivalents next week about some of the measurements. That area we looked at was 500 cubits by 500. Okay, it sits in an area of 25,000 cubits. Okay, so visually this is really quite striking in what it could be, or what it was, the vision he was given. Okay, so just keep that in mind. That's something, this is different. In verse 3, in the sacred district, measure off a section 25,000 cubits long and 10,000 cubits wide. In it will be the sanctuary, the most holy place. It will be the sacred portion of the land for the priests who minister in the sanctuary, who draw near to minister before the Lord. It will be a place for their house as well as a holy place for the sanctuary. An area 25,000 cubits long and 10,000 cubits wide will belong to the Levites who serve in the temple as their possessions for towns to live in. You are to give the city as its property an area 5,000 cubits wide and 25,000 cubits long, adjoining the sacred portion. It will belong to the whole house of Israel. The prince will have the land bordering each side of the area formed by the sacred district and the property of the city. It will extend westward from the west side and eastward from the east side, running lengthwise from the western to the eastern borders, parallel to one of the tribal portions. And this is a good note to finish off on, based on what Lee was just sharing with us, this idea of God drawing all of this back together, drawing the political and the religious under his authority and leadership. And the vision he presents to Ezekiel of the land allocation, you see a similar pattern of God allowing or allotting for the tribal portions, for the families, the space, but also for the Levites, for his place, and then also for the prince, which is very different than what we've seen in other portions of Scripture. Again, it's a vision. Okay, it's meant to have a different interpretation, understanding, not the literal per se, because we know when they go back, this is not going to happen. Okay, this layout doesn't occur. But we'll finish it out next week, so if you want to look ahead, chapters 47, 48, and we'll have fun with land distribution next week. All right, thanks everyone.